Hello, time for a Man in Great book review. Today's book is A Sorrow Beyond Words by Peter Handke, translated from German by Ralph Mannheim, originally published in 1974. This reprint edition from 2002, published by a New York Review of Books, and it's 86 pages long. Peter Handke is an Austrian writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2019, and that was one of the most controversial awards that the Nobel Committee has handed out in decades. Not because of Handke's literary ability. Almost everyone agrees that Peter Handke is one of the major German language writers of the second half of the 20th century. The controversy is over his political positions. Handke sided with the Serbians during the Yugoslav Civil War and became a denier that the Serbians were committing atrocities and mass murders. He even spoke at the funeral of Slobodan Milosevic, the notorious Serbian strongman who was responsible for thousands of Croat murders during the years of the war. And so this is a case where we readers have to deal with from time to time of a writer whose work is problematic not because of the work, but because of their political beliefs and their personal life. And so you have to deal with the question, can you separate the work of this writer from his political positions or his personal beliefs? And we deal with that all the time, not just with writers, but with a lot of artists. Richard Wagner, the great German composer, was a notorious anti-Semite. The classical pianist, Russian classical pianist Valentina Lizia, has been a supporter of the Russians against the Ukrainians and has propagated Russian propaganda against the Ukrainians. And of course, we had Anne Perry, the mystery novelist, who was a convicted murderer, actually killed somebody as a teenager. And so we have to do. And Roman Polanski, the movie director, raped a underage girl and then jumped bail in the United States and fled to Europe to avoid prosecution. So in all these cases, we have very problematic people who nevertheless were major artists and writers and filmmakers and musicians. And in the case of Peter Handke, it's his political positions that have made him controversial. He certainly is an important writer and very influential among certain other writers, as we will see. This little short novella is very it's a hard read, even though it's quite short, easy to get through. It's a hard read because of its subject matter. In 1971, Handke's mother committed suicide. She got 100 sleeping pills and swallowed them all and laid down in bed and died. And at the time, Handke, as he writes in here, had a reaction to her suicide that is very unusual. He writes in here that he was proud of the fact that she killed herself. He felt that it was a noble thing for her to do. And then to explain himself, he wrote this memoir of her life, which is in some parts is fictionalized, so it's sort of autofiction. And he wrote this immediately after her death, just within weeks of her death, and it's written in a very unemotional, almost scientifically clinical style, very detailed. She was born in Germany. To a family of lower class, working class people. Her father was a very traditional guy who believed that daughters didn't need to be educated, that their job was to have children and be housewives, take care of the family. She eventually ran away from her home and got a job. During the Nazi era, she wasn't ever very politically involved in anything, but she was excited about the enthusiasm that Hitler brought to the German people and kind of fell in with the kind of mindless support of Hitler. During the war, she fell in love with a married man, and he impregnated her, and she gave birth to the boy who would become Peter Handke. And Handke describes this guy as the love of her life, even though he clearly didn't love her enough to leave his wife. At the end of the war, she marries a soldier who she didn't love, but she wanted to get married to have somebody to help her raise a kid. And this soldier turns out to be kind of a alcoholic wife beater who didn't have any ambition and just kind of stumbled through jobs and didn't support his family very well. They wound up having 3 other children. together. She also had 3 abortions, at least one of which was self-done, self-inflicted. In 1948, they fled East Germany and resettled into Austria. And she settled down into a kind of boring life of cleaning house and raising children and not thinking about anything, and living in really borderline poverty. Um, Eventually, her husband, who becomes increasingly irresponsible and drunk, develops tuberculosis and is sent off to a tuberculosis hospital where he spends most of his time separated from his wife. His wife, the mother here, has a nervous breakdown at one point. She recovers from that. She begins, when Peter goes to college, he starts sending her books, and she begins to read literature for the first time and really starts to develop her own personality, as he said. For the first time, she begins to think for herself, and she begins taking an interest in politics and other things, and really starts to start a life for herself. But then she starts having a series of health problems, and it becomes clear. It becomes clear to her that she's developed beginnings of early onset dementia. She starts wandering off into a nearby forest and gets lost from time to time. And she comes back to her house and just kind of stands staring at the door, not really wanting to go inside. And at one point, she decides that it's time for her to end her life. And so she writes a series of suicide letters, sends them out to her family. She goes to her doctor and gets a prescription for sleeping pills, goes home, swallows all the pills, and dies. And so it's a rather grim story, but it's written in great detail and very, very unemotionally. A very unemotional approach. And this became a huge influence in the writing of the Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's famous for his My Struggle series, his 6 gigantic novels, autofiction novels about his life. And it's clear that he was inspired by this little novella, because Knausgaard also writes in great detail about the most intimate details of his family life in a way that's very unemotional. So he's clearly influenced by Handke's writing in this book. So if you are interested in translated literature, German literature, autofiction, this is an interesting book. It's, again, not an easy book to read. It's very grim. Handke basically says that, you can, well, he doesn't come out and say it's directly, but it's pretty clear from the writing that he feels that his mother was kind of beaten down by the patriarchal family he grew up in, and she grew up in the kind of stuffy conservatism of the 1950s and 60s Austrian politics. She really didn't have a chance to really bloom as a human being because of all the forces against her. Of course, her having to raise all these children, and her husband, who didn't help much at all in the children's growth. So it's a grim story, but it's one that's very powerful, and it will stick with you, I think. The book is A Sorrow Beyond Words. The author is Peter Handke. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.